My name is David. By the way, what a great day it is to be a Potter.
Yeah.
My name is David Mack, and I would like to thank everybody for coming out to hear this discussion on inclusion, Dave, HBCU, and Clay. Our distinguished panelists of educators, clay artists, a researcher will embark upon a controversial conversation on race outreach initiatives, discoveries, diversity in the marketplace. You, the audience, will have the opportunity to interact with our panelists in a 16-minute Q&A. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to our distinguished panelists for joining me on this incredible journey for discoveries, inclusion, and reflecting on a discussion in American ceramics. Secondly, I would like to thank the NCERCA Selection Committee for recognizing a need to have this conversation and allowing our distinguished panelists to tell their story. A special thanks goes out to Dr. Eric Conway, Chairman of the Fine Arts Department at Morgan State University, for supporting and allowing a group of Morgan students to attend this conference for the very first time. Are the students here? Please stand and be recognized. I would also like to thank Amy and Henry Gibhart for their suggestions and assistance in helping me to plan this discussion, and my wife Linda for her patience and her ongoing support. At this time, it is my honor and privilege to present our distinguished presenters. Please hold your applaud until the end of the introduction. David Richard McDonald, Professor Emeritus, Ceramics, Syracuse University, and the NCERCA 2011 Excellence in Teaching Award recipient from Syracuse, New York.
Thank you, David, for all of the heavy lifting necessary to put this together, especially for people who don't do email like me. I appreciate the invitation, and I consider it an honor to be part of this August panel. What I'm going to share with you is a narrative of some things in relationship to my life as a I was going to do it after. Okay, all right. What was I saying? Oh, well, I wrote all this down because if you've ever sat through a ceramic tech glaze lecture in my class, you know I can go off on many tangents. So I wrote it all down, and please excuse me for reading it, but I appreciate your patience, okay? So it starts. There I was standing in the office of the chair of the art department at the University of Michigan School of Art, Architecture and Design. I had just arrived on campus and was getting settled in with my wife and my 18-month-old son, Joseph. I had graduated from Hampton Institute, now Hampton University in Virginia, in the spring of 1968. I had applied to graduate school for admission to Virginia Commonwealth University, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and New York State College of Ceramics, which when I was growing up, that was the Mecca for ceramics. It probably still is. And the University of Michigan. At that time, I didn't realize that graduating from a historically black college and making work that was highly political would adversely influence how seriously my application would be considered. I didn't have the pedigree or the connections to be seriously considered. I was not accepted at VCU, Alfred, didn't hear from the University of Michigan, and was accepted at the last minute at UMass, Amherst. My wife and I decided to go to Amherst and enroll, and so I enrolled in the fall semester of 1968. After halfway through the semester, I received a phone call from a gentleman named Robert Stowe of the University of Michigan. He seemed to be wondering why I hadn't responded to the acceptance letter and the offer to attend graduate school there and the awarding of a full graduate fellowship. I told Professor Stahl that I hadn't received any communication and had assumed that I had been rejected there as well. Professor Stahl, who was the head of the graduate program at the time, was bewildered, but said he would check into the matter and get back to me. He did call back several days later, shared with me that my letter notifying me of admission and graduate award had not been sent. It appeared that the documentation associated with my application had been, in quotes, misplaced. The graduate fellowship that I was to receive was awarded to someone else since I hadn't responded by the deadline. However, Professor Stahl was able to offer me a teaching assistantship instead. Interestingly enough, I later discovered that there had been several difficulties with the applications of other African Americans candidates that were part of the same affirmative action initiative that was mounted by the University of Michigan. This revelation presented me with a great opportunity, but it also represented a dilemma. My wife and I had already settled into housing. She had found a job on campus, and I was settling into studio life and making friends. The person I had hoped to study with, Dr. Lyle Perkins, was on sabbatical. I wanted to talk to someone to get advice. So I called Dr. Perkins, who was highly respected by my undergraduate professor, Joseph Gilliard. So I made an appointment to talk with Dr. Perkins. He listened patiently and asked a few questions. He said he would like for me to remain at UMass only if I truly wanted to. He suggested that I travel out to Michigan to look the school over and base my decision on all the information. I told him I appreciated his advice, but I didn't drive, and I didn't have money to buy a bus or train or plane ticket. He suggested that I find out the cost of airfare, and he would work something out. Several days later, I told him the cost of the ticket, and he handed me his personal check for that amount. After visiting Michigan's campus and seeing the facilities, and most importantly, impressed in meeting Professor Robert Stahl, and discovering that he was an African American, and at that time there were very few African Americans teaching ceramics, of all things, on major college campuses, I decided that the University of Michigan is where I had to be. I returned to UMass and told Dr. Perkins that I had decided to transfer to the U of M. He was gracious in receiving my decision and wished me the best of luck and never asked for the cost of the fare, the plane ticket. So here I was, standing in the office of the department's chair, trying to get the lay of the land, and I am sure he was trying to get the measure of me. The chair was Thomas Larkin, and he was a former painter who had fallen in love with clay. Although we covered a number of topics during our talk, there was one remark he made that stayed with me all these years. We were talking about all the things that we like about clay and some of the frustrating things and why we chose ceramics. Then he said, half jokingly, "You must be a glutton for punishment, not only being a potter, but also a black potter." Little did I realize how insightful that remark would prove to be. Syracuse University had also embarked upon a serious program of diversifying their faculty and staff. And Professor Larkin was instrumental in getting me an interview for the second ceramic professor position that was being considered at this newly created College of Visual and Performing Arts. The School of Art was part of this second largest academic unit on campus. It was composed of 11, the School of Art was composed of 11 different departments with over 60 faculty members. The ceramic area was part of the Studio Arts department, composed of painting, sculpture, and ceramics. For many years there, I was the only African American faculty member in the entire college. During those years at Syracuse, I can recall many awkward moments when some of my older faculty colleagues tried to learn how to relate to me. I received a liberal education in the subtleties of racial prejudice practiced by seemingly enlightened and educated individuals. I lost count of the number of times my qualifications were questioned because of the perception that I was an affirmative action appointee, and how this perception influenced my promotion and salary decisions. The exception was that the expectation, was that I would not last long enough to be seriously considered for tenure. Fortunately, I was teamed up with a colleague that took me under his wing and mentored me in many of the aspects of running an academic ceramic program that serviced over 160 students a week, from introductory to graduate level teaching. That colleague was Henry Gernhardt, and we worked together for over 25 years. As I look back over the years I've spent in academia, I have come to the realization that although we in academia consider the academic environment to be special and set apart, there are often little differences between the situations and people we encounter that are in the real world and those on the campus. There are individuals who, regardless of what you achieve, will never consider you equal and see any effort to make and see or perceive any effort to make the playing field level as an unfair advantage. But there are also individuals who realize that they have the opportunity to make a difference in another person's life and to make that extra effort and to help and nurture. In my life, 4 of these individuals were Dr. Lyle Perkins of the University of Massachusetts, Robert Stull, University of Michigan, Thomas Larkin, also of the University of Michigan, and Henry Gernhardt, my colleague for over 25 years at Syracuse University. Unfortunately, we will always encounter individuals that will judge you either overtly or covertly because of your racial or cultural heritage. We are a long ways from realizing a colorblind society, and those that say we have reached that are either naive or disingenuous. This has been so graphically illustrated in recent events. One might ask, why is it necessary to continue to have these types of conversations and panels? How can it be that decades after the adoption of comprehensive civil rights legislation, racial identity remains the key variable in shaping the opportunities and the life chances, and in some cases, the life expectancy for a certain group of individuals in this country? The observation has been made that slavery, legal discrimination, segregation has been the dominant social relationship between African Americans and this society for approximately 350 years, from 1619 to 1969 and the passage of the Civil Rights Movement legislation. That time span represents approximately 80% of our national history. How can anyone reasonably expect such historical, political, economic, and cultural practices to be instantly reversed? Racism is woven deeply into the American fabric and on so many levels and in so many subtle ways that even the election of an African American president cannot substantially unravel it. One manifestation of this culturally sanctioned racism is the privilege of one group over another. Historically, African Americans have been made part of a subordinate group, and conversely, whites or European Americans have been designated the superior group. And from this construct flows the notion of white privilege. Please do not think that my condemning white privilege is the same as condemning white people. White privilege or whiteness is a structured advantage that has been subsidized by certain cultural, political, and economic practices. And in many cases, white people aren't aware of its existence because they perceive it as just the way things are. But whiteness has an enormous economic cash value. In other words, it's worth a lot of money to be white. I recall reading in one of the NCIRCA journals that one of the keynote speakers remarked, "Why is it so white up in here?" And that is an observation that I have made for many decades as a student and later as a faculty member and practicing artist. I have been to NCIRCA conferences where to see another black face was a rarity. Thankfully, I've seen that slowly changing thanks to ceramic teachers throughout the country encouraging their students of color to attend, and also to the NCIRCA organization and its efforts at outreach. I taught for nearly 40 years at a major research university, and during those years I have had in my classes from intro ceramics to the graduate level only around 20 African American students. The 2 black graduate students I taught, I personally recruited. I have always wondered why there were so few. I am certain the cause is multifaceted, but I think there may be a very strong economic component. The initial investment needed to set up a ceramic studio is substantial and requires the access to a particular kind of space, and additionally to financial resources that are not always available in the African American community. As university teaching positions become harder and harder to find, everyone will be suffering. But my concern that the less privileged among us will suffer disproportionately more. I have taught and worked in clay for over 55 years. I have been encouraged by the progress that has been made thus far, but we have some ways to go. Unfortunately, the path ahead will not always be clearly marked. I have many observations and questions, but few answers. Thank you for your attention. I now have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing the next panelist. Blaise DiPaolo earned her Master of Fine Arts in Ceramic Sculpture with a minor in glass from Rochester Institute of Technology, School of American Crafts in 1997. She did her undergraduate work at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. DiPaolo is the Associate Professor of Sculpture at Morgan State University in Maryland and an Associated Artist member of the Baltimore Clay Works. Thank you.
Good morning. I would like to begin my talk this morning by reading a quote from "To Conserve a Legacy, African American Art from Historically Black Colleges and Universities" by Richard Powell. And the introduction is by Kinsasha Holman Conwell, and she explains the importance of HBCUs in this way. For more than 100 years, historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, have been in the forefront of the preservation of African American history and culture, much as the civil rights movement of the late 1950s and the 1960s launched major museums dedicated to African American culture and history. The post-Civil War era signaled the rise of a host of institutions of higher learning founded specifically for former slaves and free blacks. In the period following the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Many black colleges and universities were created. Some of the earliest of those institutions began to assemble important collections of African American art and artifacts, as well as significant holdings in European and American modernism, African, and Native American art. So Morgan was founded in 1867. In America today, there are 101 HBCUs. Morgan ranks 19th overall. However, Morgan is first in the production of Fulbright Scholars, third in advanced degrees awarded to African Americans in architecture, fourth in engineering, 13th in communication, and fourth in the production of African American PhDs or black PhDs. So in my opinion, as long as higher education remains a predictor of economic advancement, then HBCUs are as relevant today as they were in 1867. The gentleman you see here is Dr. James E. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, a Baltimore native, was an accomplished artist and a prodigious collector who worked closely with great American artists such as Romar Bearden and Elizabeth Catlett, among others. Lewis left Baltimore after high school to pursue his bachelor's degree in 1942 at the Philadelphia College of Art because the Maryland Institute College of Art was segregated. Many art schools remained segregated until the 1960s. He was recruited to establish the art department and collection at Morgan after he completed his MFA from Temple University in 1951. Over the course of his 36-year career, he amassed a priceless collection of art and shaped the careers of countless students who went on to pursue the MFA degree and become important artists and educators, one of whom is my friend and mentor, Ken Royster. And this is his photography. Ken recently retired after nearly 40 years at Morgan. During the 90s, Baltimore Clayworks founding executive director Deborah Bedwell was unapologetically recruiting artists of color for exhibition and residency opportunities, as well as board positions. Deborah showed me what it looked like to recruit black talent. She was collaborating with institutions and organizations whose work around race and ethnicity were groundbreaking. East European Ceramics and Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum are two examples of the caliber of artistic inquiry going on in Baltimore during the 90s and into the 21st century. Deborah, can you raise a hand so everyone can see? There she is. Thank you, Deborah Bedwell. Deborah cultivated an exchange program with Ken Royster to bring clay classes back to Morgan for an academic year after a hiatus of nearly 15 years. In the 70s, under Ethel Clark, the first African-American woman to earn the MFA degree in ceramics, there was an active clay program at Morgan. However, during the 80s, the economic downturn of the 80s, Morgan went through retrenchment, wherein 3 departments, theater, music, and visual art were consolidated into one fine and performing art department, and many tenure track positions were lost, including the ceramics position. Having said that, in 2004, 10 years after my introduction to Morgan State, Ken Royster hired me as a lecturer, and since that time, ceramics has been taught every semester at Morgan. Amen. So, one woman's determination. Yeah, isn't that great? Yeah. One woman's determination to integrate her organization and those of us who worked with her set in motion then exchange that would result in many more artists of color experiencing clay and integrating into the art and education economy of Baltimore and the state of Maryland. I asked Ken for images from his baptism series because in December 2017, I took my ceramic students to baptize the classroom at Baltimore Clayworks. Newly reopened after a thorough cleaning and reorganization, We went on a celebratory field trip, first to work with Jamaican artist Sam Wallace, reclaiming hundreds of pounds of clay, and then to have our first throwing lesson. Our Morgan studio is primarily hand building, so that was the first opportunity I had ever had to teach Morgan ceramic students how to throw all at the same time. I partnered, cross-currents is an apt metaphor for what happened at Morgan in the fall of 2017. There we go. I partnered with Morgan's Office of Continuing Education to offer their first ever ceramics classes and recruited Deborah Bedwell and Sam Wallace to teach them. Both artists have a loyal Clayworks following who took those classes and had the experience, many for the first time, of participating in an education program at an HBCU. My community art classes and I hosted 3 consecutive workshops with the clients of Baltimore Industries and Services of Maryland. BISM is a not-for-profit workforce development organization that trains and employs the blind. I participated in an abbreviated training session using a sleep shade. A sleep shade is what you see Isaiah wearing there. I used the sleep shade and a cane and took classes in both cooking and wood shop. And had I been wearing a GoPro, I think I would be a YouTube millionaire today. The main thrust of my scholarship at Morgan has been focused on developing the department's only 2 service learning art courses. Service learning is a high-impact practice that creates bridges between the professional art community, urban Baltimore public schools, and Morgan students. Many Morgan art majors who take community art classes go on to earn advanced degrees in art education, and many teach in the Baltimore City schools, 2 of which you see right here. My work in the field of service learning and civic engagement in academia is an extension of the work that I began in the 90s at Baltimore Clayworks. My students and I often partner with my friend and colleague, Jay Cohen. You see one of his community art projects there. Jay is an Open Society Institute fellow, an accomplished and successful painter, and enlightened community artist. Jay has trained and employed many Morgan students over the course of the past 7 years to work with him on large-scale public art projects, both in the region and nationally. Like David said, economics presents the biggest barrier I see to students of color pursuing a life in clay. The Black family has not recovered from the 2008 recession at nearly the same rate as white households. In an age of unprecedented economic inequality that has devalued labor and thus the middle class, more families in America are struggling than not. College students at HBCUs are overwhelmingly first-generation college educated. Inherited wealth is the exception, not the norm. The majority of Morgan students work part-time and some students work full-time while they pursue their degrees. Many students who come to Morgan from Baltimore City public school system are both under-resourced and underprepared. Therefore, retention is always a struggle. This generation of college students, regardless of race, is taking on unprecedented amounts of college debt for an undergraduate degree, and many students have to secure a stable income as a priority. That prevents a lot of talented young Black students from pursuing more than one ceramic art class at Morgan. So what have I learned in my years as an honorary member of the professional Black community? Well, what I've learned is that I can no longer presume that I don't have racist tendencies or that I am not a racist. I have had to learn to acknowledge that racism and sexism are part of the culture I was born into, and that my deprogramming takes attention and intention.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
and that race is painful for all of us, but it is most painful for people of color. And so I have learned to listen more and talk less. So, having said that, I'd like to introduce April Hines. April lives in Philadelphia. She's an independent researcher, and she is the director of the Wanderer Project. Yeah. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So let's see. With glaring white kaolin eyes and baring teeth, face vessels have captured the attention of academics and scholars alike. Their glaring faces and mysterious origins beckon us to ask questions like, what are they, who made them, and why? While many have questioned the uses to which these vessels may have been used, African Americans in Edgefield, South Carolina, and elsewhere saw face vessels as imbued with power. In particular, they maintain that face vessels played an important role in African American burial and funerary rituals. Consistent with similar ritualistic practices in West Central Africa and indeed throughout the plantation Americas, face vessels served a very important ritualistic purpose, not only in the late 19th century, but indeed through the 20th century. The first known mention of face vessels was when Edwin Atlee Barber recounted his conversation with South Carolina planter Colonel Thomas J. Davies. The latter owned a plantation called the Fire Bricks Works, a pottery in the town of Bath, then part of Edgefield County. Davies recalled that in 1862, local slaves had made homely designs in coarse pottery, including weird-looking water jugs, roughly modeled on the front in the form of a grotesque human face, evidently intended to portray the African features. He also noted that face vessels were not made in secret, and that the white population in 19th century South Carolina derisively regarded them as having African presidents. These curious objects, which I have seen in several collections, labeled native pottery in Africa, possess considerable interest as representing the art of the Southern Negroes, uninfluenced by civilization, and we can readily believe that the modeling reveals a trace of Aboriginal art as formerly practiced by the ancestors. Aside from Barber's interview, nothing of substance was published on Edgefield face jugs until the early 1980s, when they captured the attention of Robert Ferris Thompson, a prominent art historian at Yale University and an authority on Yoruba art and the African diaspora. Thompson cautioned people not to ignore the distinctive cultural context in which the makers of face vessels worked, or the possibility that African traditions influenced their work. Much of Thompson's work centered on slave potters that originally came from the Kingdom of the Congo, and on the visual relationships between Edgefield face vessels and Bakongo wooden figures, such as Minkisi. Thompson noted that the use of kaolin to make the eyes of Edgefield face vessels white relates to the ancient northern Congo practice of inserting porcelain fragments with the eye sockets of carved human figures, as well as the West African figural carvings in which the color white is associated with the land of the dead. Professor Jason Young explains it best. Congo Minkisi and Edgefield face vessels share striking artistic and aesthetic similarities. And though they are made using markedly different media and under vastly different social circumstances, people on both sides of the Atlantic put these objects to use in similar ways. In funerary ritual and burial decoration, both Congo Minkisi and Edgefield face vessels help people navigate the liminal spaces between this world and the next. Another prominent scholar in the field was Professor John Vlach, who also attested to the Congo influence and cited a historical event that would explain how West and Central African cultural traditions came to South Carolina. In 1858, when the now famous potter David Drake was in middle age, the black community of slaves in Edgefield was set abuzz by the illegal importation of more than 200 Native Africans into the Edgefield district. Vlach noted the connection that one of the last slave cargoes brought into the United States was aboard the Wanderer, which landed in 1858 on Jekyll Island, Georgia. Most of that group were Kikonko speaking, and more than 200 Native Africans were enslaved in Edgefield, South Carolina. They were to be the last contribution of African heritage into the area, and their presence most likely provided a stimulus for sustained appreciation of face vessels by local blacks. Following in the footsteps of Thompson, Vlach, and other scholars, I began to research the 408 survivors of the slave ship Wanderer and used my genealogical background to find many of their descendants. I had the opportunity to meet with some of them at the Schomburg Center in Harlem, and a few years ago, one of the families I had the pleasure to meet was the family of Ward Lee, or Sulakanji as he was known back in Africa. He lived out his life in Edgefield County, and his granddaughter, O.C. Barnes, still lives there today. They shared with me their oral traditions, which maintains that Ward Lee was a potter, and to all of our astonishment, brought with them this small white face jug that was made by Lee and passed down to each generation in his family. This face jug establishes a direct connection between Edgefield face vessels and a slave from the Wanderer. Certainly, African religious and cultural retentions were alive and well before the Wanderer arrived, but they certainly would have been a catalyst for reinvigorating these traditions. Since there was so much debate and some outright denial of their African influences by some archaeologists and collectors in the field, I realized no one had gone to the black community to ask them what they were used for. I had the remarkable opportunity, with a grant from the Chipstone Foundation and Ancestry.com, to interview local residents about their memories of face jugs and their use amongst the Edgefield African American community. That has shed new light on their use and purpose. They shared that face jugs were often placed by the doorway in order to cast away harm from entering the home. In addition, they were used to ward off evil, and it appears they may have been used in the act of conjure. Conjure, or African American hoodoo, also known as root working, root doctoring, or working the root, is a traditional African American folk spirituality that developed from a number of West African spiritual traditions and beliefs. For more than a century, researchers and scholars have noted that the funerary rituals of the Congo closely resembled those of the slave South. Reverend George Breitharp, a local county resident, recalled his own experience with seeing face vessels in African American burial grounds near Shoals Hill, South Carolina, as late as the 1980s. He told me how many of them had little jugs in the grave sites to ward off evil spirits. Those vessels were arrayed atop the burial site along with broken plates and other objects that the deceased once owned. In addition, Reverend Alexander Pope, who grew up attending Springfield Baptist Church in Aiken, recalls seeing face vessels on graves in the local cemeteries. He also shared that his grandfather had owned a face vessel and had attributed it to Dave pottery, and shared how the turnward down lips of its expressive grin was a tall tale sign that Dave had made it. These first-hand accounts of face vessels on graves would be, as Susan Cooksey argues, very much in keeping with the Congo tradition of placing ceramic vessels, both handmade by Congo potters and imported bottles of Toby jugs, on graves. Jill Culverman at the University of South Carolina completed her thesis on David Drake and identified a face vessel in the collection at the High Museum in Atlanta, which is likely Dave's work. This is by far the largest known face jug, and scholars like Culverman and Leonard Todd point out features that suggest Dave's handiwork. The curved upper parts of the ears match the handles made on Dave's storage jars, and at its impressive 28 inches in height, it's just 3/4 of an inch smaller than one of Dave's tallest jars. Another striking feature is the curved lips that perfectly match Reverend Pope's oral history of it being made by Dave. After learning these exciting new connections that David Drake, one of the most famous of all potters, was most likely responsible for the creation of Edgefield's largest face vessel, I wanted to search for its descendants. In 2016, Edgefield and Aiken counties organized a special day to honor his life and legacy. The process of exploring Dave's ancestors was a meaningful and moving quest for me. After a long process of searching through records and numerous phone calls, I finally found them. They had never heard of Dave's name. I shared with them Dave's life, his legacy, and the great and noble jars that are found in museums across the nation. In 2016, over 30 family members of Dave's grandson, Pearson Brister Jones, drove from Washington, D.C. to meet us for the opening reception for the first annual Dave Day in Aiken, South Carolina. There, we embraced, we shed some tears, and Master Potter Gary Dexter presented them with a marvelous face vessel that is a replica of the one on display at the High Museum. On the back, Gary inscribed one of Dave's couplets, written shortly after the Landrum slave sale in 1857. I wonder where is all my relation, friendship to all and every nation. Face vessels continue to evoke our attention and curiosity, and with new knowledge about their polyritualistic use, it continues to unfold. Without a doubt, they have endured, and their expressions reflect the painful emotions of slavery and its aftermath. With deep-set eyes and riveted faces, these face jugs spring forth from our past, vessels burdened with the cracks of our history, blazing with stories baked into a face full of emotion and truth. And as Psalm 78:3 states, things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have taught us. So thank you, and I have the wonderful privilege to introduce our next speaker, friend, Potter Jim McDowell, AKA the Black Potter, and he is a face jug artist extraordinaire from Weaver, North Carolina, and also a wonderful educator. So please welcome Jim McDowell.
Good morning. You don't give a black potter, a preacher, a microphone, ever. Because they're going to do something. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's going to trouble the water. Y'all heard that before, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah. But we got the Watchman up there. And the Watchman is right there. No, you're not up there yet? Okay. Jan's telling me to put him up there. Okay. There we go. There's the Watchman. This is the Watchman. And he's going to watch over what I'm doing to make sure I stay right. I'm Jim McDowell, the Black Potter. When I was a young man, about 14 or 15 years old, I went to a family funeral in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where I found my ancestors talking about face jugs and family history and ancestry. And they were talking about something called face jug. They said that the jugs were a tribal custom that came from Africa by enslaved people. Now let me say something right here first off. That jug and every other jug I make is a combination of 3 religions. In Africa, ancestor worship. In Jamaica and the islands, they picked up voodoo. And when they came to the Americas, the Christianity got on them because they wanted them to be good slaves. So that's an amalgamation, that's my only big word for the day, of 3 religions. So, you know, I've been fighting my whole life trying to get recognition. But my grandfather, who was a tombstone maker, Boyce McDowell in Spartanburg, he knew about funerary practices, and he told us about that. And someone else at the family reunion And those of you who are of color understand when the family is talking, you be quiet because you're getting ready to get your mouth put in. So Granddaddy told us about that the jugs were made out of clay. And they did scarification, and they took cowrie shells and put them on there. And then someone else told me about Evangeline, who was a slave potter, was my 4 times removed great aunt. They said she made face jugs. The family never had any. So ever since that day, I've been wanting to make face jugs. It took me 12 years from that time to make a face jug. Now, the first jug I ever made was the features of a black man. And you must remember, I had never seen a face jug until I began to make them. At the time, I was taking an adult education class at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and a white potter from down south had made a face jug. And to me, it looked cartoonish. So I made my face jug look like a black man. It had big lips and extended eyes and tribal markings, and I embowed the lips and everything with cowrie shells. And also, I make them to remember my ancestors. This enslaved people who were brought here, they not only survived, but they thrived. So I did that. And I add names on the back of my jugs in honor of Dave. Dave is my hero. I mean, I love him. I was at a museum in Delaware one time, and they had just had a show of Dave's work. And I begged them, please let me touch his pot. So they said, sit down on the floor, here are the gloves, and they brought me 3 of Dave's pots to put my hands around. So in honor of Dave, I write on the back of my jugs names like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, and Nelson Mandela. Now, a couple of years ago, a gallery owner in New York discovered me online. And I'm not very literate. I know how to do emails, but all that other stuff you guys do, I can't do. I don't do it. But anyway, he wrote me, and he said he wanted some of my jugs. And he said that I am the only potter in the United States, black potter, that does face jugs from the Congolese tradition. He calls them spirit jugs. I'm very honored to be a member there. Now, my face jugs are not accepted by everybody. Some potters in the South, they made fun of me. I've been assaulted in the shows, but overall, I have been received very well. And if you ever seen me at a show, they like me, and the educators get me in. And how I get in there, the first time I went to school at IUP, and then I realized that I could do better and have less oversight if I was a resident artist. So I would go in there and do that, and finally the Southern Allegheny Museum of Art picked me up as a resident artist. Now, often I'm invited back after you get me in there. And they also understand that I've given presentations and workshops in elementary schools and colleges, but sometimes I present workshops in studios where they have a fee. And there is where I get to use my power. I say we're going to give at least 2 scholarships to minority students. I do that all the time. I found that while there are black educators in our country, I am frequently the only potter black that these kids have ever seen. And so I have encountered educational discrimination. Now, I must say that this is about inclusion. And I have a hearing problem, so a lot of things that I could have been a part of, I did not take part in them because I didn't think I would be accepted. But I found out that educational researchers say that a low-income black child is taught by at least one black teacher, he or she is more likely to graduate. Now, that second slide there, well, the first slide is very unique. It's called The first slide is called The Watchman. And this one is very unique, this the tall guy, because the last time CIRCA was in Pittsburgh, Jack Troy and Kevin Crow, they're great potters, were conducting a wood firing at Touchstone. And that pot went in that kiln. Now, this is something that I tell a lot of the black students I meet. I was helping Jack and the class load the kill. Several people came who hadn't got their pots ready and hadn't put the wadding on them, if you know about that. So Jack asked me to stop and go inside and help those people. So I did, and then we conducted firing. And then when this pot came out, it was in the sweet spot. And those of you who understand what the sweet spot is, that's where all the ashes and all the flames and everything. And I said, Jack, how did I get in the sweet pot? He said, hey, if it had been my pot, that's where I wanted it. So that's how I got in there. The next pot is called Gonna Lay Down My Sword and Shield. Now, I'm a soda, oh, my wife keeps telling me to ship it. I'm not familiar with these things. But anyway, I'm going to lay down my sword and shield. This is soda fired with blue ash runs, the pipe. Now, the pipe was significant because slaves were not allowed to have a, it's not there yet? Okay, yeah. My wife is telling me, lay down my sword and shield. Okay, that one there is wanted, the one on the right is to lay down my sword and shield. I got tired of fighting. I got tired of wars. I got tired of always hearing about somebody killing somebody. So I said I'd make something that would do that would, maybe you could have some seeds and grow something. So that's why I did that. And I must say that I'm a journeyman potter. I have ingratiated myself with anybody who has a kiln. I had a white friend who said, look, and you guys talked about it, we don't have the money. When it was over, your studio was gone. You didn't have access to clay, you didn't have access to the thing. But I have learned how to fire kilns, gas and wood. I have learned how to take shifts nobody else want. I have learned how to bring food. You know, I have learned how to get in, so I can get in. So this next slide, and I think that's number 3. That's the one that says to lay down my sword and shield. But I'm going to number 4. A lie cannot live, the one with the horns. That's a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's a Val Cushing orange chino glaze. It was a 3-day firing. Oh, got to move it. Okay. Yeah, y'all trying to teach me. It's okay. There it is. Okay. That's a Val Cushing glaze. I'm a collector of glazes. I'll try anything. And I know most people will say, I'm only going to make a 500-gram batch. I'll make a big bucket. I don't believe in paint. I dunk the whole thing down in there. So that's what that one is. And I place glass into the eyes so that it runs down like tears. Also, the horns are put there to scare the devil away from your grave. Because you remember, they made these things ugly. So when they got ancestor worship, voodoo, and Christianity, they understood about Jesus. They said, oh, Jesus, okay. So they put it there because they knew about Jesus, and Jesus would save them, but the devil would be scared away from your grave so your soul could go to heaven. Now let me go back for a second. Because I say you can go back, and I got to go back. Right there, the one that's kind of orange looking, got wings on it. Now what happened with the wings is the fact that in black mythology, and y'all have heard of Bear Rabbit and the tails and things, well, black people would be disappearing, and every now and then they say, where'd they go? He said, they gave them wings and they flew away to be at rest, to get away from you. So, and there were people who really believed that black people could fly. So that was there. Now the next slide was one that really struck me very hard. This is TRAYVON. When that happened, I was troubled. I was really angry. But you know, when you get a certain age, you learn how to channel that anger. He's Amber Celadon, he's fired in a gas kill. And I wrote on the back of him, I am so mad that TRAYVON was killed for being a hoodie-wearing black man. I made the jug, and I put the hoodie part on it, and I set it aside, and my wife said, look, you have to open those holes up and put the string there. Because I made TRAYVON inside instead of outside. And because sometimes artists will do work, and they don't get to really see it. When the guy took the photograph of TRAYVON, I said it looked like a tomb. And so that's also in the gallery in New York. And I really like that piece. Now the last piece is called The Slave. Gas-fired Chino, and I made the chains out of paper clay. When I had that piece there, it was about this tall. It was beautiful. Had no marks on it. I put a face on it. I put the eyes on it and everything. And I got to thinking, why would someone beat a slave just because they could? So I said, what does it feel like to be beat? I took a clothes hanger and made a strap out of it. And I began to beat this piece, and I began to punch it. And I lost it. I lost it, and I cried, and I walked away, and I put a cloth over it, and it stayed in the closet for a while. And then I took it out, and the gallery owner in New York City took it to New York City. And it was 2 years ago. It was night of a major snowstorm in New York City. And someone came out and bought that piece. They felt my pain and they bought it. And I was touched. Because when we share our art, we are transparent. We show you what we feel. We tell you what we feel that way. And so that's why I do face jokes. I don't want us to forget. I don't want us to forget, but I want you to remember that we are proud people. We come from a long heritage. This country was built on the blood and of black people. And so I want you to remember that. And I thank you for listening to me ramble on. Amen. David Mack. Yeah. Our next presenter is also our moderator. And I'm going to go off script here because I got the floor. I'm like Michael Jackson. I got the mic. He conceived that we would be here. Now, he says it took 2 years, but I believe it took 10 years. He said God gave him a vision to do this. Now, David Mack is an educator. He's a ceramic artist. He's a clay activist. He's from Spring Hill, Florida. But he's also a man who stuck with us. Now, I am not literate when it comes to this computer stuff. And herding this group was like herding cats. But he stuck with us. So I want to present David Mack to you, and I want you to hear him.
I knew it was going to be difficult to go behind this man. On June 22nd, 1894, the great Frederick Douglass gave a commencement address at my alma mater, Frederick Douglass High School in Baltimore, Maryland, and this is what he said. The colored people of this country have, I think, made a great mistake of late in saying so much for race and color as the basis for their claim to justice and the chief motive of their effort and action. I have always placed more attention to manhood than to any variety of human family. We should never forget that the ablest and most eloquent voices ever raised for the black man's cause were the voices of white men, not for race, not for color, but for men and for manhood. They labored, fought, and died. Away then with the notion that a man must be black to be true to the rights of black men. That's a very powerful statement. From a man who was born a slave, abused as a child, a fugitive, but still managed to rise above all obstacles to advocate for equal rights, human rights, and women's rights. 124 years later, race, gender, and culture continues to define socio-ethnic income, class stratification, incarceration populations, education, and one's own life cycle. However, I believe that potters over the years have been true to their craft and to Douglas's manhood concept. You see, my clay brothers and sisters understand that a defeated clay nation will not be defeated, and discrimination, stereotypes, and racial ignorance will not defeat us as a clay nation. As my Facebook friend Roberto Lugo has said, this machine kills hate. So the people who work on the wheel, they must be divine lovers. Love for brotherhood, love for sisterhood, and love for all mankind. Today, I throw vessels and sculpt people of color that reflect my culture, my experience, and my passion to keep hope alive. My body work commemorates a rich heritage culture of historical truths and continuous discoveries of the disenfranchised and the underrepresented. I've created more than 40 vessels within 15 years of my 30-year clay career. A white gentleman entered my booth one day and said, "Where are all the white people?" Another white gentleman said, "They're all in the museum." And I said, "Touché. Even today, Frederick Douglass is alive and well." My work has been rejected by online networks, but accepted by galleries, colleges, and museum curators, vilified by some judges, praised and presented awards by others. Some customers have expressed mockery, while other parents have made it a learning experience to teach their kids about important figures in history. Overall, as a black potter working in America, the marketplace has reacted positively with memorable, priceless experiences. I do have a moral and ethical responsibility to keep the legacy of these people alive. I'm not affected by folks rejecting my work. Rejection is good. It brings out the best in my competitive spirits, and it fuels my passion to carry on. Although I attended an HBCU, Morgan State, I didn't know about many of these people, but I would hope that the next generation of truth seekers will continue to walk in my footsteps to keep hope alive. Researching forgotten details and examining uncovered truths are the basis for my creative interpretation and discussion. Education, athletics, humanities, and the military were important factors in my development, and it represents the key core subjects of my research. Although school-trained, my work is inspired by tradition and culture, and I consider myself a folk artist with an academic background. While some scholars say, no, you can't be school-trained and be a folk artist, I say nonsense. Without the conceptual visualization based on tradition and culture, you couldn't do what you do in the classroom because you need that. Technically, I have evolved from being a functional potter into a functional clay activist. In the words of the political dissident Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, in order for art to be relevant, you must be an activist. I'm not affected by a controversy that talked about Dr. Charles Drew, a Morgan State professor and coach and the first director of the Red Cross, who pioneered the bloodmobile and the preservation of blood plasma. Dr. Drew soon found out that World War II black soldiers could not donate their blood to white soldiers. So disturbingly frustrated, he resigned as the director of the agency. A controversy that tells the story of the persistent union labor and leader and organizer, Cesar Chavez, who reformed Hispanic farm workers' benefits. This whole concept for me started in 2004 with the three faces of Martin Luther King. Although I experimented with hidden 3D figures much earlier, this particular vessel right here laid the basic foundation for what I do today. When people say the real McCoy, they're not talking about the Hatfields and McCoys. They're talking about Elijah the real McCoy, who invented a lubricating machine in the 1700s and allowed machines to run concurrently during maintenance. Elijah the real McCoy. David Drake, who we learned from April, was a controversial, complex poet, potter, and slave, but he may have also influenced pottery on a national scale. You see, the Edgefield pottery development of alkaline glazes was also used by a pottery factory owned by the Reverend John McKimmy Wilson. A white potter, Marion Durham, and a black potter, John Chandler, who worked with Dave at Edgefield, relocated from Edgefield to work at the Wilson factory in Texas. Some historians believe they brought with them the Edgefield alkaline glaze formula. Of course, Dave was certainly responsible for mixing up that formula, and those guys probably learned from Dave. I'm going to hold on to Maria for a minute. I'm going to give you a slight sidebar of the Wilson factory. There were three black slave potters, Herm, Wallace, and James, who also worked at the Wilson factory. During emancipation, the Wilson brothers were the first African Americans to own and operate a pottery in Sebring, Texas, in the state of Texas. And the Wilson brothers also built a school and a community for their community. This was the building was in the neighborhood of 1869, and the factory soon closed after the death of Herm, who was the founder, in 1884. Maria Martinez, Pueblo indigenous native and master potter extraordinaire, invited to the White House 3 times, received an honorary doctorate, but never received the world attention tour as Bernard Leach and Hamada. And finally, the great Jim Thorpe, another indigenous native, a forgotten hero, and one of the greatest athletes to ever live. A 1912 Olympian gold medalist in 2 events, athlete of the century, and president and founder of a football league, which we know now as the NFL. But Thorpe's citizenship was always challenged. Medal strip, and it wasn't until 1924 that the United States gave citizenship to indigenous natives. That is certainly, and the first inhabitants of this country, and that is a sad testimony in American history. Local, state, and federal EEO laws require that all institutions, universities, and colleges be equal opportunity employers regardless of race, gender, religion, sexual preference, and age. Those standards should also be reinforced when selecting visual artists for lectures, workshops, residencies, and even slideshow presentations. Why isn't this the norm with some college programs but ignored by others? Is it because the work is not good enough or inferior? B, is it because you just don't know any minority artists? C, is it because there's no information available on the internet? Or D, is it because the artist doesn't look like you? A, B, C, D, or all of the above. I don't know the answer. Maybe someone in the Q&A can attack that problem. But I do know you owe it to your students, especially students of color, to adapt transparency and present a multicultural curriculum. Take a road trip. Visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., a great place to educate yourself and your students. Kudos to Penland and a few other art organizations for their online diversity policy statement. Let's have more prestigious universities adopt a similar policy, take affirmative action steps to recruit more skilled minority resident artists who are talented, empowering, critical clay thinkers, and passionate about what they do. And finally, we need to establish an all-access facility for all people, especially people with obstacles, not disabilities, people with obstacles. Students, teachers, stand up, raise your hand, be heard. If you think your institution does not give minority artists equal representation and does not represent an all-access facility environment, funding should never be a problem, should never be an issue. Okay, you need to contact your dean, program director, or ADA administrator, and we can work this out. Because this is a wonderful subject material that we use every day. The magic of clay should be inclusive, and everyone should have the opportunity to enjoy it. I do have a list of a few minority artists available, and immediately after this session, I would ask you maybe to come up and take a picture with your cell phone so you can establish a database. And that wraps me up. At this time, we will have a 16-minute Q&A to entertain any questions you might have for WOW panelists. Question?
Yes, hi. I just wanted to thank everyone for their talks. I really enjoyed this. The question I had for really anyone up there or anyone in the audience who knows, I was curious about the fact that Dave's descendants weren't aware of his pottery legacy. So I'm wondering who reaps the benefit of from the sale of his work? Like, who gets the profit from when his work is exhibited or sold? Does anyone know that?
Not his family.
Not his family. No, they didn't know of their connection to Dave. They had left Edgefield, South Carolina because of the conditions, and they were just, they like many African Americans, went north, and they went to Washington, D.C. to get better jobs, have a better racial climate, and you know, I'm trying to help them as best as I can to celebrate Dave, share Dave. As far as who profits, not the family, no.
I have a friend, he's actually my dentist, and he collects early American stoneware, and he showed me a catalog from an auction where some of Dave's pots were for sale, and one of the pots was for sale for $60,000, another one was for sale for $137,000. So I'm sure the family doesn't get any percentage of that.
I want to address something there was about Dave. Carolina Clay put out a book, and it was by Leonard Todd. And I've been studying Dave ever since I've been doing pottery. And they had a statement in there about Dave's leg getting cut off. He got drunk one night, they said. And did I get angry? I wrote that man. I said, man, your family owned Dave. Black people were escaping and going west and escaping from slavery. You cut his leg off because he was the cash crop. So I let it go because I wasn't ready to strangle this man. But I want to let you know that this man was educated. He could read and write. He wrote poetry. And he did not get drunk and fall over the railroad tracks. And if he did fall over the railroad tracks, he would have bled out, okay? So I'm not stupid. So I dealt with that, but I didn't go far enough. But I'll be damned if I'm going to set back now. I'm going to go far now. Don't say that stuff to me anymore.
Next question.
Hello. I teach high school ceramics and sculpture for the past 17 years in Ferguson, Missouri. And my majority of my students are African American. And this panel, and I went to the Kansas City and CIRCA, and David and Sharif made a huge impact watching them, I talk to my students a lot about my experience watching them work. And you are correct. A panel like this shouldn't be just once, or we shouldn't just talk about it in a ballroom, because we do have a lot of struggle still. We talk, and I watched the TV, and Ferguson is brought up, but they don't talk about the impact of the children. They don't talk about what the resources have come and gone. They don't talk about the fallout of things of that nature. And so I'm always inspired by finding discussions about this, because it helps me go back and be a better educator to my high school kids. So I want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions? You know, I want to just add one other comment to Blaze's information about HBCUs. And so many people say, well, why do we need HBCUs? What, you know, we can mainstream everybody into one institution and just keep that money. A lot of people don't realize that 20% of all medical doctors and dentists came out of 2 HBCUs, Howard and Mahaney. Two-thirds of Army officers came out of HBCUs. Two-thirds of all federal judges came out of HBCUs. 5/8 of all black professors at white institutions came out of HBCUs. We need HBCUs.
Go ahead.
My question to you is, or to the panel, I live in a part of America in a medium-sized city where most of the educators are all Caucasian, and we have quite a few African-American students who are never exposed to our side, and I'm going to say it that way, of history. And I do pottery in that area, and I'm actually the only black person I know in that area who does pottery. So when I talk to inner city children, black children, about it, they look at me as if I am bizarre. And I say to them, do you not know that your fathers and forefathers from Africa were great potters? So I'm in the process of trying to institute some type of local program in order to educate African American children and bring about a program whereby they can go and learn to, I call it play and clay. Do you know any organizations within the United States that help to start programs and processes like that in order to get African American students and inner city students who aren't exposed to it, who don't have the resources? Could you give me some advice on what I might be able to do, or a good starting point for me?
Anybody want to handle that? Where are you located?
I live in Springfield, Illinois.
Well, the only one response I have to that is the reason why I focus so much on community art at Morgan is that often we are in community art working with kids of color in the inner city, and so to have Morgan students is the most powerful, motivating inspiration I can think of. They can see a young black person, phenomenal role model, working in art, and that I find is very, very powerful. Same thing with recruiting African American artists. And so it would all start with a lot of recruitment on your part, in my opinion, and then just collaborate with organizations, and be unapologetic about finding that black talent. It is there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Come and see me. I will come. I do these kind of things. I'm
Okay,
a resident
we're
artist
sort
who
of
goes
running out of time, and we will take a 1-minute closing statement
Thank you.
from each of our panelists. We'll start with David.
Well, as I said before, there are many issues and questions that need to be answered, strategies devised, and the problem is it's not always a clear-cut problem. One of the books I was reading a few months ago about prejudice and racism is that there's a dilemma in the American notion of Americanness, and that is we are a culture that is made of many other cultures. And one of the American dream, or the American dream, was to create Americans regardless of their cultural or ethnic origin. But at the same notion, there is the need for many of us to embrace our cultural heritage. And in many instances, those two ideas are in conflict. And what we have to do is figure out a way in order for certain people to have pride in what's been created by their cultural predecessors, but also feel a part of this country and not feel that they're excluded because of their interest in pursuing their cultural heritage.
In closing, I would just like to thank David Mack for really motivating all of us, keeping us on track, and making sure that we were not just prepared, but that we really came to the table with this very important topic. And I cannot imagine that it would have happened without David. So I'd just like to thank him.
Thank you, Dave.
In closing, I just want to say that I thank the NCA and David and everyone for being here. And one of the key things that we can do is teach. If you know how to do it, show somebody. I thought I was the worst student until a white teacher grabbed me one day. They gave us all 25 pounds of clay, and everybody was making snakes. And I took and carved with a popsicle stick a bird on a stone. And they were all walking out. She grabbed me in the chest. She said, "You're an artist. And I'm going to tell every other teacher in this school that you're an artist so you would not fall back." So if you know, to that lady who was a potter, call somebody and just start it. That's all you have to do. Just start it somewhere. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank the people at NCECA for having us here. It's absolutely an honor. Absolutely. David Mack is wonderful to work with, and he just brought us all together, and I'm just so honored to be part of such a distinguished panel. And anyone, educators or artists that want to learn more about face vessels, I have a 2013 article in Ceramics in America that's actually online now, and you can visit my website at thewandererproject.com. But thank you for coming out today, and we hope you enjoyed.